Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank. Time to be first member, FDIC. And glad you could join us once again. Josh Whittison in for Todd Marino. And it is 7:45. And our interview presented by Marcus & Mack, voted best law firm and best personal injury lawyer 3 years in a row in the Best of Indiana County contest. Visit them online at marcusandmack.com. If it's Friday and if it's 7:45, it must be Bob Pollock of the Penn State Extension Office joining us for his a weekly look around the world of agriculture. How you doing, Bob?
Good. No substitutes for me today.
I feel like the substitute teacher, you know. I'm hoping I'm the cool substitute teacher, you know.
There you go.
But you know me, I like to focus on the things that this backyard, the hobbyist gardener, might want to do. So I know we're getting into the season that we should be getting ready to plant everything if we haven't already. But it's been pretty wet as of late. Is that going to affect anything, any timing or scheduling of what we do?
Yeah, it's been cool and wet. Ground has good moisture in it.
Finally.
Yeah. Well, there was moisture down in the ground. The top had dried off, but there was moisture down in the ground. Mm-hmm. We're kind of coming to the end of that time frame where if we need to move plants around, transplant existing plants that are in the garden, we're, as the new growth is just slowly beginning, and that's actually an okay thing in the spring to have things move slowly. We had a couple very cold nights earlier in the week, so hopefully if you had things peeking through the ground that were sensitive, you had those covered. Otherwise, they may have gotten burnt back a little bit. But usually those plants, especially perennials, I know I had some bleeding hearts that were just coming up, and they were still pretty tender, so we covered those. But otherwise, everything else was in pretty good shape. And part of plants being able to adapt to cooler temperatures is just as the foliage comes out, if it has just a little bit of time to harden off a little bit, a lot of times it'll be fine when we have these little cold snaps or little freezes.
Yeah.
But it's good that things are kind of just moving slowly. That allows those plants to, as the ground warms up a little bit. It was really just this week that the grass really started to
look
change.
Green. Yeah. It looked green again.
Come out of that winter period and start to look like it was spring.
I mean, it did look beautiful, at least driving around a little bit and seeing all the countrysides. And yeah, you are starting to see things turning greener by the day almost, it seems like. So as long as plants are dormant, I know I moved some things around in the last 3 to 4 weeks, and it was a good time to do that because they hadn't started to put on any new growth yet. Once the buds come out, then plants are starting to grow, and we've kind of missed our opportunity. You can still squeeze it in depending on the plant and how much of the root system you can, if it's a smaller plant and you can get the whole plant lifted out of the ground and move it without damaging hardly any roots, that's good. But there's other plants that really need to be dormant when we make that major move. Mm-hmm. And then now we're starting to move into where we can be planting plants. Yeah,
really.
Definitely. I know a couple of family members who have started their vegetables already, some of their hardier ones, hopefully.
Yes, right. So and again, you're going to time that. So that when do you how hardy is that plant? If it's a vegetable plant, then it needs to be one of the cool season plants, usually or typically the ones we're getting started now, unless we have them in some sort of a hothouse.
Hothouse, greenhouse, things like that.
Where we can manage the temperatures. And then we're looking at, okay, when can if we're going to plant it outside in the garden, when do I think I'm going to be able to do that? If the frost is an issue, then we've got to look at typically, second, third week of May.
Mm-hmm. All right, so my
doing that, so you got to back up if you're planting seeds. You got to think, when am I going to plant this, transplant it into the ground, and then how many weeks does it take to grow that plant from a seed to get it to a transplant that's big enough that I can put out in the garden.
All right, so you just have to continue to back time it a little bit. Because I remember when I was younger, whenever I was helping my mom and dad in the garden, we had. I remember one year it was planting it right on the weekend of Memorial Day.
Yes.
Because that seemed to be the perfect time for those plants, and it was the tomatoes, the peppers, and things like that. But I would imagine things like lettuces are
Right.
doing pretty good at this time of the year. That's more of the cool weather plants at this point, right?
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about some things. By the way, folks, if you want to call in, give us a call, 724-479-1160, 724-349-WCCS. Bob will be glad to answer your questions. So I want to go into what the novice gardener might be thinking of. Let's think about this guy who is doing this for the first time ever. Aside from timing, which is tough as we mentioned, what are some of the more common mistakes that you've heard of for the novice gardener to make?
Probably trying to plant too soon, or not even thinking about that. Just because a plant might be available,
it doesn't mean it's ready to go in.
It doesn't mean it's time to plant that plant. We have both air temperatures, soil temperatures. It can be a little warmer outside, but if the soil still hasn't warmed up, if you're planting seeds or transplants, the seeds will just sit there in the soil. Yes, they need moisture, but they also need a temperature that's warm enough in the soil for germination to occur. And working the soil too soon, like now when it's so wet, we can cause more damage than good. And so oftentimes it's just better to wait a little bit and be patient, and the results will end up being better.
I would think tilling, especially now, would be kind of difficult, kind of tough to do. Of course, some people are using the tiller, some people are using their spades and their shovels, but it's just about making sure that nutrient-rich ground, that earth that's been kind of recharging itself, is being turned over and being used at the upper levels at this point.
Yeah.
But now it would be difficult to do because I think you get a lot of mud.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It'd be messy.
It'd be a mess. Yeah.
All right.
Doesn't work very well. Things stick to each other. You can't really get the seeds in the ground at the right spacing. And
spacing is the other thing that people, I don't think, take into account whenever they are starting out for the first time.
Yes. How big will this plant get? And of course, that does vary a little bit. Site dependent, soil dependent, growing conditions, all influence how big that plant might get. But yeah, we do tend to. The plants are small, so we plant them tighter together rather than, okay, this plant is small now, but it will grow to, maybe it'll be, we need to plant things 1 foot apart, and you've planted them at 6 inches apart.
Yeah, at that point you kind of risk the roots getting tangled up, right?
And it's easy with seeds to overseed too, because seeds are small, and you drop a seed in the ground and say, wow, that doesn't, these are small seeds and they're a little, let's put them closer together when there is a distance that those plants need to be. And sometimes it's okay to overseed because we usually don't get 100% germination. So you can bump that up a little bit, overseed, with the goal of going back and thinning. Something like beets would be an example of that.
Okay.
You can plant those in a row. And sometimes it's hard to evenly get things spaced, so you put too many in there, knowing that you might get a 2 or 3, out of 10.
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't be that many. You might get 1 or 2 at the most out of 10 that might not germinate. Okay. The other thing is you might have some visitors come along. Birds, and the like,
deer,
skunks. There's several things that can come along and also influence that germination.
Last thing I want to see is a polecat over there. Trust me.
So
skunk in the garden.
So putting a few extra seeds in the ground is okay, or just extending the row a little bit longer, because you've kind of figuring out that's another thing where we could make a mistake is overplanting, not realizing how much lettuce you need to eat in a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah, we see. I see it all the time with zucchini.
Yeah,
I mean, we have neighbors who come over. Here's about 5 or 6 more big tubes of zucchini. Oh, geez, oh my! I can only do zucchini bread so many times.
So one plant might have been more than enough,
for a family or for yourself.
With the amount of yield that they can make, on a good healthy plant. So that's another area where you can easily overdo it, and then trying to plant too much or do too much at one time, especially if you haven't done it before, or maybe you haven't done it since you were a kid, and now you remember back to that, but then weren't involved in all the details.
Right. At that point, the parents told you put it right there.
Yeah.
And now you got to determine where to put the plants and everything. And you've got a good point there. I mean, overdoing it. I mean, if you're just starting out in this as a hobby, you don't want to overdo it. Otherwise, it might kill your enjoyment of it too. Right. Because the maintenance that's going to come up within the next few months, watering it and making sure that it's free of bugs and also free from other visitors, as we will call them. That also becomes extra work, and it might get frustrating at that point if it's a lot of it.
Yeah, so it's always good. Pick a few crops that you really like, that you use pretty often, and start with those, and then do it on a small scale. How much of this do I eat a week or every 2 weeks? And of course, some plants, you're going to get one harvest off of a plant.
Yeah.
And other things like the zucchini, you have one plant, but it's going to continue
to keep giving you
to make zucchini. So, and summer squash is the same way. And so, and tomatoes, a few plants can go a long way. And that's where you could maybe do a couple plants of slicing tomatoes, big red round tomato slicers, and then also maybe do a couple paste tomato plants, Romas.
Yeah, some smaller tomatoes.
Yeah, and then, maybe a couple plants of cherries, and then you have a little variability there to work with and go from there.
So one more thing before we say goodbye, just really quickly, flowers obviously are also being thought of this time of year. Of course, Mother's Day next month, where there's going to be a lot of flower sales. But if you're going to plant them, now's a good time to get them started in seed, and I guess you start them small in the pots and then transfer them out to the garden later on.
Yes, yeah. Usually there's a transplant step or two involved in there before they get in their final container, especially for hanging baskets and things like that.
All right. Well, hey, you know what? Some great tips for the novice gardener. Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that. Indiana in the Morning presented by First Commonwealth Bank. Bob will be back with us next week as well. And our interview presented by Marcus & Mack, voted best law firm, best personal injury lawyer 3 years in a row in the Best of Indiana County contest. Visit them online, marcusandmack.com. In our next half hour, some representatives from the Indiana Free Library join us here on Indiana in the Morning.
In this ever-changing complex world of technology, who do you turn for expert solutions? EMB Computing, now in their brand new state-of-the-art